From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
It was a family business that I worked for. So his son, who ran their, sales division, was like, we have to get into 3D printing. It's like cutting edge technology. Now you can 3D print metal in house with these like $10,000 sintering ovens and, all that kind of, now we know what we know, but all those things that were promised in the world of 3D printing in 2016. And they were just convinced that it was going to be a really good complement to, their industry. They'd been around for, 40 years at that point, just selling enormous $1 million pieces of machinery.
That was Haleyanne Freedman. Haleyanne is a business development and engineering professional with a demonstrated history of working in a variety of industries and specializing in additive manufacturing. She has accumulated skills in the application development, material specification, and design for additive manufacturing. She currently is a global engineering business manager for 3D printing at Holland Company. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcast, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. All right. Haleyanne, thank you so much for joining the episode today. I'm excited for the conversation. I like to start with all my guests and kind of getting down to the roots of kind of where you started. So kind of maybe as a short intro, where'd you grow up? Kind of where are you from? And how did you get kind of on the path towards getting involved in the 3D printing space?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So I actually grew up in Sacramento, California, where there's not a ton of manufacturing that doesn't have anything to do with wine or almonds. And so I actually didn't have any exposure to industrial manufacturing growing up. My mom was a teacher, is a teacher. My dad works for a bread company. And so it was never really presented as an option, for me. So everyone was always telling me to go into medical device sales or anything that had to do with medical, because, California. After, I had kind of dabbled in a couple different industries and wasn't really finding a place where I fit. And so I very, very randomly, I was like, you know what, I'm going to go work for an animal shelter and I'm going to, try and work with, I love animals. So I'm going to go work with an animal shelter. And I ended up getting a job with a no-cost spay and neuter clinic that took me out to Wisconsin, like northern Wisconsin, like middle of nowhere, Northwoods, Wisconsin. And I was like, sure, I'll do this for a year. Why not? But you can only work for a nonprofit for so long before you have to pay for your bills. And so I decided to look into something, else and got into optical lens manufacturing, which is very boring, like very, very boring, but very lucrative because people need to see. And so, that was kind of my reentry into just medical / general manufacturing. And I really loved the capital equipment portion of that. I really liked working with the people who were, your blue collar manufacturing people. And so everyone kept telling me, you got to go into industrial tool sales or, something in that regard. So I was looking at a job that was at one of the larger industrial machine tool importers in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. They do OKK and HNK smart machine tools. And he called me in for the interview, and this guy could not have been more stereotypically like machine tool guy. His name was Dick. And he was like, can you come in right now for an interview? I was like, sure, I'll be there in 10 minutes. So I showed up and, he's basically yelling at me for the whole interview. And he's like, my son told me to buy these 3D printers or Mark IV printers. I don't know anything about them. I don't want to know anything about them. You can figure them out. You can run the department. And I was like, oh, sure. How hard can it be? And it was like super hard because I had no idea what I was doing. But I found them so interesting. So like very quickly, because I'm a maker at heart. I've always been into whatever I can make. And so I taught myself to design. I took apart the printers like a million times and like completely fell in love. And then my second week on the job, I bought my first 3D printer. Now I have 9 and like no other hobbies. And all I do is 3D print. But I like completely fell in love with the industry, and I fell in love with the people who need to use it too, like industrial machine tool, injection molders, like those are my people. And so I completely fell in love. And so I've been here now for just over 5 years, and I couldn't imagine working anywhere else. So very unconventional path, but I also don't really know anyone who got into 3D printing on purpose. So, I think a lot of us in the industry ended up on a weird path like that.
And what was it that kind of drew you to the industry? I mean, maybe a little bit deeper question of like, what made you stay, or like, was it the people? Was it the technology? Was it the machines, even early on? And like you mentioned sales a couple of times, were you interested in doing kind of sales related things, or were you interested in like different parts of the machines, the materials? Because it sounds like you've done kind of quite a bit in that time frame. Was there something that just made you get out of bed and were excited to kind of go to work on Monday?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I'm one of those people who's fortunate enough to be very technical, and also can talk to people and, can do that sales and just side of it. And what I kept finding, especially working for that machine tool company, is there was this huge disconnect between this like magical 3D printing industry and then the people who needed to use it. And they weren't meshing. Like they weren't able to get the message across. The machine tool people wanted it to be a be all end all, print, metals on a printer that costs $5,000, just stuff that's just not physically possible today. And the 3D printing people weren't really sure how to get them to understand, like, here's where it fits, here's how you do all those different things. And I found it really easy to kind of bridge that gap because I can explain it, and I can, it's a little bit easier when I tell people, oh, that's a terrible application, let's look at something else, and have those kinds of conversations. And I saw so much potential, and I still see so much potential that we're just not doing enough with, especially in like injection molding. See all these applications that are just such a huge pain for the industry. And it's like, wow, we can solve a lot of your problems, not all of them, but we can solve a lot of them as long as we bridge this communication gap. So it's still what gets me out of bed to talk about 3D printing, because I know how just capable it is. And I know that there's not a thorough enough understanding. So if I can be a part of that adoption and really help further the advancement of the industry, I'm super passionate about that.
So tell me more about kind of that first interview that you had, and was it Mark Forged, and kind of the conversation with Dick, I think you mentioned about like, why did they have printers? Like what were they doing with it? And why were they like, what kind of drove them to the point where like, hey, this is like kind of make it or break it. Like, can we get someone to figure out how to use this and actually make it worth our investment?
So I think if you're familiar with the company, if you remember the Metal X launch when that first came out, that was the time that they bought into it. So I think part of what happened was it was the rep that came in, right? That said, hey, we want to access machine tool companies. Here's what we've got, and now we're going to be able to print stainless steel, and you can do it on a system that costs X amount of dollars. But it was a family business that I worked for. So his son, who ran their sales division, was like, we have to get into 3D printing. It's like cutting edge technology. Now you can 3D print metal in house with these like $10,000 sintering ovens and, all that kind of, now we know what we know, but all those things that were promised in the world of 3D printing in 2016. And they were just convinced that it was going to be a really good complement to their industry. They'd been around for, 40 years at that point, just selling enormous $1 million pieces of machinery. And so I think part of it was a little bit of a snap decision for them. It was just like, okay, it's cool. Let's, and it's only $100,000 to become a reseller. Let's just become a reseller. And then I think when they had their apps engineer who had been there for as long as they had existed, he had learned how to use the equipment, like learned Eiger and learned how to print on it. But all they were printing was like he didn't even print like Pokemon or something like that. He printed like cones and like just like the weirdest stuff. And they weren't really applying it. So they had it for 2 months and tried to give it to their salespeople who were just like, I don't know how to sell this. Like, we can tell people we've got 3D printers. But they didn't really understand how it could be applied. They wanted somebody else to come in and tell them, this is how it should be utilized. And this is how we could, access our customers. So it was kind of a weird business decision, but I do now believe, now that I work for a larger company that's in injection molding that doesn't do 3D printing as its legacy business, that's like the way to get customers. It's so much easier than prospecting and having to go get somebody from, square one, to take somebody who already trusts your opinion and show them, hey, we understand your process and this is how it can be applied and how to utilize it. I mean, that's a fantastic business model for 3D printing.
And so let's kind of get into what you're doing now with Holland. So kind of what what does, for those who aren't familiar with the company, what do you guys do? Kind of what kind of historically is the M Holland business?
Yeah, so we've been around for about 70 years. We're the largest injection molding distribution company in North America. So we sell a lot of pellets. And so when they were first starting to look at 3D printing, they had a market manager named Todd who lives in Ohio, and he was part of the NEO cluster and in that little hub of 3D printing in the Cleveland area. So we started to go to, check out what Owens Corning was up to and what these other companies were doing, because it was something that they knew they had to kind of keep an eye on, but weren't really sure what to do with. And they had signed a distribution agreement with Owens Corning for X-Strand, which, that's now been sold to BASF. But it was just 30% glass-filled nylon and 30% glass-filled polypropylene and just spools. So I came in for this interview and they were like, we got this distribution agreement and we're going to sell materials to the 3D printing market. And I was like, ooh, that is not how this works. That is not going to, you have 2 SKUs. That is not going to work to sustain an entire business unit. But also there aren't enough people with printers out there to sustain a business, just selling materials. So my job was to come in and figure out how we should, as a business, develop a profitable unit where we can leverage 3D printing technology in whatever ways necessary. So since I started, we've now evolved to, we do distribute materials. We've got like our e-commerce website, and we have like 350 different SKUs and photopolymers and powders and, all those different things. But we also help people pick printers, because most of our customers have no clue what they're doing. They say, we want to get into 3D printing, but what should we buy? And that answer is very different from customer to customer. So we'll test printers and say, oh, well, based on what you want to print, we've had good experiences with this one. We think that you should get this one. Here are the accessories we recommend. We don't directly sell them, but we'll recommend them so that we can help them adopt it. Or it doesn't really make sense for you to buy a printer. Why don't you outsource it? We'll print stuff for you. Or we'll introduce you to a partner that also will, one of the many, many service bureaus that'll produce parts for you. But our overall goal is additive adoption. So there's so many applications in the injection molding world that are sub 250,000 parts per year that makes sense to produce with 3D printing. And we've seen some of our customers on the smaller custom molding side even lose business to service providers in the 3D printing area. So we want to help educate our molders, because we do think that they are the future of additive production, help them get the technology in-house if it does make sense, or at least protect their existing business and transition those applications on behalf of their OEMs so that they can utilize the technology in an effective way. So it's a very abstract and the world's longest elevator pitch for what we do. But we do like everything in 3D printing that helps further adoption.
And my understanding, and this may be totally off, when I think of M Holland from a typical perspective, right? You have like the big polymer market, right? For like a lot of injected molders, they have to buy like train loads of material from BASF or Evonik or whoever it may be. But M Holland is kind of in the middle world. They'll buy some of that and kind of distribute it to molders who may not need as much, right? Like they're kind of in the middle, small to medium size production in the kind of grand scheme of things. It's still a lot of material, but you can kind of partition some of that. Is that still the case, or is that not really what you guys do as much?
It kind of depends on like the supplier, because some suppliers have these like distribution networks where they can get material places. But as we've learned over the last several years, logistics are horrible to deal with. Getting material from Europe to Mexico or Europe to, Ohio or, wherever it needs to be is a huge challenge. So a majority of the people who work in our business are on the logistics, procurement, supply chain side, because we are that supply chain. It's like, how do we get that material from here to here? Material suppliers often just want to focus on making it. So almost all of what we do is in rail cars. Gaylords are the smallest quantity that we sell besides sampling. So we have even a business unit that only deals with like resale of commodity resins, where their sales are like 20 rail cars in a transaction, just like stupid amounts of plastic, which also made it really difficult when I was coming in and I'm like, we're going to sell a spool and it's measured in kgs and it's eaches and we're going to ship it via UPS. How did that go? I mean, like, because it's a different model, right? Like you could essentially buy this on Amazon if you wanted for $50, right? Like that's not necessarily like you don't need a PO, you need a credit card versus some of the conventional way that some of this material is sold. That was a journey. We did not have credit card processing when I got there. What we had to do for my first like 8 months is we had to take, because they're kgs of spools, right? So we had to take 1 kg and 2.2 kgs, convert those into pounds, then like modify the cents so that it lined up because it was never perfect, and process via PO and put it on the back of a truck that was taking pellets to a customer. Oh, it was horrible. It could not have been worse. And I knew, coming in, it was like, okay, we're going to have to change everything. And fortunately, with it's being privately held and everything, it probably took me less time than it would have taken if I was working for like a giant conglomerate, organization. But we separated into our own business unit so that we could get into our own ERP, CRM management system, because we had to measure things in eaches, and the system could not do that. Does not do eaches. And so we transitioned all of that over, so we're an entity within Holland now, but we worked with a warehouse in Ohio that does, that also does order fulfillment on the side of like, they sell like t-shirts for other companies, they do some of those each things. And so we own a little corner of their warehouse where we have all of our spools that are lined up, that are, skewed out, and they are able to fulfill that way. But I mean, that was so hard for the company. Boxes of powder, easy, super, super easy. That took like 3 days, but to get the filaments processed on credit card, that took me like a year and a half. It was quite a journey.
And so do you do other forms of materials? You've mentioned filaments a lot, but do you do powders as well?
Yeah. And photopolymers. Photopolymers are a little complicated because they have to be refrigerated. They're hazardous expiration dates. If you send them across borders, nobody knows what they are. And so they just look like, bottles of something dangerous. So those are a special challenge, but the boxes of powder are a lot easier because they're big. And, they're a little bit easier for us with our distribution network. So we can host them, and we've got like 65 warehousing locations. We can host them in other places besides Ohio. So thank goodness, it makes it a little bit easier.
And so is that like powder for SLS, like nylon 11, nylon 12?
Yeah. Yeah. So we carry the ALM family of powders. Okay. So anything that ALM EOS has. And then we're also expanding now into BASF, powders as well. Just they're such a huge part of our pellets business. And we've been distributing their filaments for 4 years now too. So, I mean, it couldn't have been a better fit. And then they of course make, some MJF and, other powders as well.
Certainly. And so one of the things you mentioned when talking to some of the injection molders and helping them with some of these shorter run projects that may have a good fit for additive, you mentioned kind of that 250,000 part number. I guess what are, in your opinion, and as you're working with these customers, like what are you seeing in terms of where does it make sense to use additive manufacturing versus injection molding? I mean, you have things to consider, certainly price and material availability and surface finish, quantity, all of that. Like what are your kind of framework tenets that you use when you're talking to your customers?
So, our dream, like the whole additive industry, is how do we start a product from inception, for additive, because then we don't have to convert the geometry. So we at least put that idea out there, but that is a much bigger conversation. Like, how do we completely change the way that your design engineers and your product development experts develop a product? So there is that piece, but where I've seen the most success, especially in the last couple of years, is, you walk into some of these mid-sized molders, they've got rooms and warehouses full of old, nasty molds that are rusty and gross. And like, they have to hang on to them contractually for a million years. So I was at one of my first customers post-pandemic, because I had forgotten how big of a problem it was, because you don't see it. And they had probably like 1,000 different products that they had to hang on to these molds for. And they had little plastic baggies with like 5 parts in them, just in case the OEM said we need 10, of something, or, whatever it was. And, we looked at all of these different geometries, and it was like, of those 1,000, not all of them can obviously be printed, and especially if they're certification reliant, or if there's no dual specification opportunities. But there were a lot of geometries where it's like, this is a foot buckle on an exercise bike. And so there's no reason we need to hang on to a $40,000 tool for 7 years, when on year 6, day 364, they're going to come in and say we need 10. And that's just an insane cost. They have to rebuild that tool. So huge opportunities there for just, manufacturing the stuff that, they only need a couple thousand or a couple dozen or whatever it is. And that's so much business. Like, when we looked at that from a business perspective, at first it was like, oh, but then that's only a couple dozen parts. No, like that's like hundreds of thousands of parts per plant that end up getting produced, but of variable geometries, which is the dream. Like it's like a larger scale of the Invisalign model, all these different geometries, and it only makes sense. So that's where we've seen a lot of the success, just because that is such a huge pain point. And, the manufacturing of tools in general for injection molding is just such a high costing point, but then labor too. You can't get skilled labor right now. You lose an operator, you're out an operator for 6 months. So if you're able to either outsource that without having to invest too much in, anything else, that makes a huge difference. But of course, then we at least have an easier conversation about how do we design this product for the future. The next time we have to design a product, let's dual spec in a material so that when a polypropylene plant blows up and explodes and we can't get it for 4 months, we can easily step in and, produce this with 3D printing without skipping a beat, or, do all those other things that 3D printing is able to help with.
And how much of your job is maybe like the qualification part, right? Like there's some convincing of people to switch, whether that's a mechanical property issue, how long is it going to last? Will my customer accept it? Can I get it at different colors? Like what are some of the considerations you see on a day-to-day basis to get over that kind of activation energy to go down that direction?
Yeah. So the way that I built our group was, and it came from my technical background and understanding that this is not a sale that somebody who's just a salesperson can come in and sell 3D. Like it just doesn't work. You have to understand all the nuances, and you have to be able to answer the weirdest questions and answer them like right now. And so our group is built on all engineering, people. And anybody who we have brought in who is not technical, it's like the expectation is you're going to learn to be technical, and you're going to learn really quickly because you have to. So we've got a material science engineer who does material matches, and, we'll do the side of, okay, we have to look at this application. What does it have to be produced with? If it's a PC PVT, is it possible that we can only use a PVT and use a blue card certified PVT, or get the blue card certification and then further that application? It's such a big conversation, because selling the idea of 3D printing is what we're all selling. It's how do we actually do this entire process? You can't just say, oh, we've got materials, good luck. So we've got a design engineer on staff. We've got applications engineers on staff, and all of us, at the end of the day, we're all applications engineers. We all have to look at geometries and say, this doesn't make sense. And then we have to look at the ROI aspect of it too, of, okay, well, how much are you currently paying for all these elements on the injection molding side? How much is this going to cost outright for you to produce in-house or, outsource? That's like, I'd probably say that's like 85% of what we do. 15% is, looking at all the other solutions and, constantly researching the rest of the industry, but it's all evaluation, all qualification, and then, trying to convert and match as best we can.
And so with that, a lot of injection, or my sense, having seen a lot of factory tours and been on site with manufacturers, that the adoption of new technology, whether it's 3D printing or not, is a big step, right? Like today, you probably don't have operators of your existing equipment. So bringing in new machines that you have to get new operators for or train different people for is a big challenge. So how much are you seeing in terms of like, hey, we see this part, it's a good opportunity for you to use 3D printing. One path is to go buy the printer and do it yourself. The other path is finding a service bureau to do it. You're going to pay a markup, but then you don't own the equipment. If it's a one-off, then you don't have to worry about it. They'll handle all the design and printing and some of the quality stuff. Where's kind of that balance today?
So a lot of the powder bed fusion, we end up, recommending people go outsourcing because they're huge and, they are a lot more difficult to run than I think people think. And so we actually developed what's called the Transparent Data Program. And so we worked on this with one of our outsourcing partners who, we've been working with since the very beginning. And they were saying, we need to figure out how we can just get more of these production jobs. And we're like, well, if we could give people the data, the data that says, here's how much the material costs, even like showing them what the markup is, because they don't care. They're happy to pay a markup. Like they're in that same business. They understand the business model. They're not going to say, no, give me, whatever, but to show them, okay, this is how much you're going to pay for material. Here's how much you're on average going to pay your operator. Here's how many hours the operator had to spend in doing this. Showing them on the powder bed fusion side, that's where it's most popular. That has helped most of them understand that it is not a good idea to buy a powder bed fusion printer tomorrow. You need like 6 to 12 months to qualify and make sure that you've got enough applications to justify that, because you do need a dedicated operator. And then you need a backup in case that operator gets hit by a bus. You absolutely need, an infrastructure that's lasting and supportive to make that work. And so that's been a lot easier of a conversation because, of course, I believe as a super 3D printing nerd with a million of my own printers that everyone's got applications to justify purchases of printers. But on powder bed fusion side, it's just that initial entry point of $150,000 for the cheapest machine that's reliable in an industrial setting is a lot. That is a lot. That's a capital purchase. It's a little easier to put an Ultimaker on your credit card. So the Ultimakers, photopolymer machines, those are easy conversations, because if I've got enough applications for 7 FDM printers and 2 photopolymer printers at my house, you've got enough applications for 1 Ultimaker in your plant. You just do, and so that's a really, really easy conversation. And even if they print stupid stuff, I tell them, let your engineers print all the Pokemon they want, because at least they're going to learn how to use it. And then you're going to come back and see all the areas that, you can actually apply it. But using that transparent data program was a huge step, because we weren't getting effective conversions on powder bed fusion, because it was like, yes, it's going to be great. The material properties match, the surface finish is great, and we can dye it and we can do all these amazing things and it's going to match. And they're like, okay, but we only have this one job.
Sure.
Yeah. So then that kind of helped get the future 10 jobs. And we've actually seen people then end up getting their own pieces of equipment after, 12 months. And we've even gotten to the point where we've told a customer like, hey, you're spending hundreds of thousands on powder bed fusion parts per year. Maybe it's time to get your own machine. They're like, no, we're good outsourcing it. We don't need to bring in a piece of equipment. We're good doing it this way. And, whatever works for the business model.
How much these days do you hear about kind of the idea of sustainability within additive? Is that a topic that people are interested in? I mean, I think you can justify it from a couple different options, and like whether the material is sourced sustainably or recycled, or using just less material than you would injection molding or something like that. Is that something that customers are interested in these days?
So, I mean, I got a little bit different perspective because I'm neck deep in plastics, and, so my opinion even on how sustainability is structured is very strong, because plastic is very sustainable if, it's people who aren't. But the plastic side of the conversation, every single molder that we're talking to, it's a top priority, especially this year. Like whatever happens, in January where they switched objectives, every single one of our customers said, how can we get more sustainable resins? We want to look at bioplastics. We want to look at all these other things. And when it comes to additive, we've been talking about sustainable materials for a while before people really cared about it. But what we found is that on the OEM side, they're looking at weird materials. Like they want algae filled, just like the most random things you've ever heard of, that I'm like, this is a larger carbon footprint than PLA, but whatever, it looks ugly and is marketable. I understand. But what we actually set up, which hasn't been as popular as I thought it was going to be, and it may in the future, but for tooling jigs and fixtures, we took a post-recycled ABS from a supplier in Indiana who, rechops pellets, turn that into filament, and then, applications like pucks for hot filling, or, other plastics tools that are used in pretty high quantities. printing those when that tool retires, which is usually after like a 9-month run, taking those parts, re-chopping them, and then reintroducing them into the recycled ABS and bringing it full circle was the most sustainable solution that we were able to, to stand behind. Because, as a plastics company, it's obviously, we have a whole sustainability division in Holland. So we care a lot about sustainability and how we can make sure that we're supporting those initiatives as the world becomes, less plasticized. And so, but also trying to direct people towards what's actually sustainable versus what's just cool and marketing and like green is, also important. Because sure, if you really want some algae filled PLA, by all means, use some algae-filled PLA and good luck cleaning your nozzles. But, if you actually want to reduce the amount of plastic waste, because I don't know how much you 3D print on your own. I have so much plastic waste. It's ridiculous. Just trash cans full of plastics, and they're not marked, so they can't genuinely be recycled. Unless you want to pay for those boxes from Waste Management, those $50 boxes that are like this big to go recycle them. But the lack of markings is like a big problem. So I think that conversation is going to start happening more and more, especially as the sustainability is adopted more significantly on the injection molding side. That business is booming now, and plastics is trying to find those more sustainable resins. But I don't think that we're genuinely there yet in additive. It's like, yeah, we use less material, we might have an overall less significant carbon footprint, but I think we're still at the stage of like, how do we get people to use us in general before we figure out how, to make it a little bit more sustainable. So I think the solutions for them are going to be relatively easy for us to implement. And it might be like regulating, you have to print a marking on your parts or something like that. But yeah, I haven't had too many people ask in a genuine, significant way, like, hey, how do we make this more sustainable?
And so switching topics a little bit, you're also heavily involved in the Women in 3D Printing group. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about kind of that and kind of what you do with the organization?
Yeah, so I'm involved in Women in 3D Printing. I'm the national chair. So I joined originally as the ambassador for Chicago. And there's not a ton of 3D printing in Chicago. There's like 5 companies. And so we were a reasonably small group. Our first event was like 5 people, and it was mostly men. And we started, hosting our events, and I started getting more and more involved with the organization, and it completely boomed. So I joined in 2019, I think 2018 or 2019, when it was still really small. And then I got added as the North America chair in 2020, and we just completely blew up. So we went from having like 7 chapters and like very, very passive, chapters and events to having tons of events. We now have like 3 different chapters in Ohio, and we've got like ambassadors being added like every other day. And we're starting to really formalize the organization. So it's been a really cool thing to be a part of. So, Kristen is now our new president as of November of last year. So that was a huge transition. But we've been doing a ton with, getting involved with all of the, larger organizations like SPE and SME and, Rapid and, AMUG when we're kind of allowed to, and, all those other, different industry events. And we've just seen so much support and involvement from all the different companies in the industry that it's been a really cool thing to be a part of. So I'm really just like a herder of ambassadors to try and make sure that people have support and, fix some tech problems where you need it and, answer questions and do things like that. But I'm very, very passionate about representing the involvement in the industry because it's, when you go to something like AMUG, I always make the joke, it's the only trade show you can go to where there's never a line in the women's bathroom. If you need some peace and quiet, go to the bathroom at AMUG. There's like 2 people in there. But, it is such an underrepresented group, within the additive organization and really manufacturing in general. And so the more that we can continue to inspire women who, may have had an unconventional background like myself, who didn't understand that this was even an option, and, help people who are even in middle school, high school, or college understand that this is a totally viable career path, especially if you're creative, artistic. You don't have to have an engineering background. You can learn, all those other areas. That's something that's really important to our organization.
And so kind of 2 final questions. One, kind of talking along that kind of workforce of the future, kind of what advice do you give to people who are kind of starting down the path of looking at new careers, maybe thinking about additive manufacturing or manufacturing in general? Anything from your career so far that you've learned and like to share?
Yeah. So I'm one of those people that, like, when I get in an Uber and somebody's talking about their kid, I'm like, you should put them in 3D printing. It's a great opportunity. But I think that there's an element of 3D printing that's so artistic that, it's engineering focused, but, the sculpting elements and surfacing and, those elements of design that aren't as commonly used outside of industrial design and traditional manufacturing, that are such a legitimate and valuable career path for, people in those, just general arts industries. So I'm a little bit biased because I did go to an arts high school, and so we didn't have anything to do with manufacturing, but we had theater and visual art and, all these other areas. And I'm always talking, I still email with my old principal. I'm like, we should get these people enrolled in some CAD design programs, because if they could learn how to do this, it's a lot more lucrative, financially for them, and a longevity from a career path standpoint, to put them in CAD design and industrial design and teach them how to sculpt, because sculpting CAD designers are very few and far between. Like, you have to teach yourself that, or find somebody at a place like MHub or something to teach you how to do those types of things, because it's not a very common, skill set. And to have a mind that's capable of, creating those geometries from scratch, like that is a talent. That's hard to teach. So anybody who's able to do something in the creative realm, like I was a maker from the start, so that's why I was able to really pick it up quite quickly. I think that that's kind of an underserved area where we should start looking at talent, not just, what MIT grads can we try and recruit into 3D printing? Like, no, let's go look at, the trade schools and, the high schools that have arts programs, and try and encourage those people to consider this path, because it can be so lucrative and it's so very, very, very needed. When we looked for hiring a design engineer, it took us like 8 months to hire a design engineer, because finding somebody who was even just willing to learn to surface from scratch was very, very hard. So I know it's a little bit more of an abstract view, but that would be my advice for, furthering our industry development.
And last question, kind of, what are you excited about for the rest of 2022?
I'm really excited for all these printer companies that have been dragging their feet to launch their next models. I know that we've got like 6 new models that are coming out at Rapid, and we saw a lot of hardware delays because of COVID and stuff like that. And I am so excited to see the new versions of everything. I know that even on the FDM side, the high-speed extrusion stuff is starting to expand beyond the few manufacturers that we know about. And is getting better. I'm really excited to see that. And I'm also really excited to see the newer, lower cost SLS and powder bed fusion platforms that are becoming more common in the US. Those are starting to make a really big splash. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm thrilled about Rapid. Like, I cannot wait to go, because I know that there's so much cool stuff that's going to be coming out. And I'm just really excited to try it and then see if it can solve some of our customers' problems.
Awesome. Well, I'll certainly see you there. And thank you for joining the show today, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.